Now the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geragthy.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geragthy of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Good, bad, and crazy martinis for you today, although not in that order. Jim, we start with the bad, and it's in response to what seemed to be a very solid international demonstration of support of the people of France and the fight against terrorism that, of course, struck Paris last week at the offices of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine. And obviously we know the motivation. The people were screaming it as they carried out these murders. 3 of the people responsible for the terrorist attacks killed last week, but there's this massive solidarity in Paris. You even had Netanyahu and Abbas, just a few people apart, linking arms in the front row of this major demonstration in France. But there was no major American representation. The U.S. ambassador to France, who was an Obama bundler, was there, but nobody that anybody would actually recognize. Here's Doug McKelway from Fox News giving the administration's explanation for why the United States had such a poor showing there.
A senior administration official pointed out to Fox News that U.S. security requirements would have been intrusive for the president to show up, that Ambassador Jane Hartley, an Obama campaign bundler, was there, and that President Obama has been unequivocal in his support of solidarity with the French, making that unscheduled stop at the French embassy, as you'll recall, on Thursday evening, where he signed the book of condolences with very emotional remarks. He ended his remarks in that book of condolences, Vive la France.
Jim, he signed the book. What more could we ask?
Since this morning, it's really kind of been fascinating to see how much this has accelerated and really become a more far-reaching bit of outrage. And we'll talk a bit about that in our second martini. But basically, since this morning, there have been 3 explanations put out by the White House or administration officials. The first is Kerry's comment that this is quibbling because we had our ambassador there. Now, think about it. We've got Netanyahu, we've got Prime Minister Cameron, we've got Mahmoud Abbas, we've got the King of Jordan, heads of state. But hey, it's okay. We sent our ambassador, so that's cool. So the first explanation is we're making a mountain out of a molehill, which obviously does not seem to be flying particularly well. The next explanation from an unnamed administration official was that the security concerns of the president would be a distraction, so he didn't want to go. So, Greg, how serious do you think the security concerns are for Bibi Netanyahu to walk down the street in Paris?
Pretty significant, I would think.
Cameron, that guy's got no security. Merkel, how about all of them in one place? Do you think there's any security in that spot? You think maybe that's a tempting target for terrorists? And then my next question would be, so what was the point of the march then, Greg? That we're not intimidated? So literally, we don't show up to a rally designed to demonstrate that we are not afraid of terrorists because of concerns for the president's security. Basically, what would I say? No, actually, you win this one, jihadist. You got it. We're not showing up, And as soon as I mentioned this, a bunch of people said, look, if you're Obama, how much faith would you have in the Secret Service these days? Or maybe there just weren't enough good prostitutes in Paris to get the Secret Service to go out there. We can kind of chuckle about this, but it really does send this awful signal. Then the third one, I saw this over the Daily Mail. I have not seen it confirmed, but allegedly what the president was doing yesterday afternoon was watching the football games. And that, if true, is appalling because, as people have noted, not only did he not go to the Paris rally, there was another one in Washington sponsored by the French embassy. And if he, for some reason, let's say he's under the weather and he's got a cold or whatever reason, okay, fine. How about Vice President Biden? Secretary of State John Kerry was halfway around the world on a trip to India. I can understand maybe changing his schedule is a big difficulty. But Holder was in Paris and didn't attend. So it's just an absolute top to bottom, complete dropping of the ball on the part of the administration. And I think to kind of foreshadow our next martini, like Jake Tapper, there are a lot of Americans who feel like the administration has embarrassed them yesterday.
It was in numerous sources in the mainstream media, but we're going to focus on a couple of moments on CNN, one in written form, which is Jake Tapper, which we'll get to in just a second. Here was John King with his panel yesterday and looking at some of the headlines around the country as well.
Here's some headlines this morning because the United States sent no high-profile official there. Look at these headlines this morning. The Daily News says 40 leaders marched, 3 million people in Paris to defy terror. None of these men showed up. meaning the leaders of the United States here, the president, the vice president, our secretary of state, our attorney general. The news says you let the world down.
And so then Jake Tapper, writing at CNN.com, tells a story about how French people were stopping him on the street, thanking him for being there as an American and as a reporter. And he says, I say this as an American, not as a journalist, not as a representative of CNN, but as an American. I was ashamed. I certainly understand the security concerns when it comes to sending President Barack Obama, though I can't imagine they're necessarily any greater than sending the lineup of other world leaders, especially in aggregate. But I find it hard to believe that collectively, President Obama, Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, and Attorney General Eric Holder, who was actually in France that day for a conference on counterterrorism, just had no time in their schedules on Sunday. Holder had time to do the Sunday shows via satellite, but not to show the world that he stood with the people of France. There was a higher-level Obama administration representation on this season's episodes of The Good Wife on CBS. So Doug Schoen, the famed Democratic pollster, who's been pretty tough on Obama ever since he became president, said he essentially told the world he didn't care yesterday.
Yeah, two things come out. First of all, I like to think of myself as a pretty sharp-tongued Obama administration critic, but I bow down to Jake Tapper with that observation. I mean, that is one of the most stinging indictments I have heard of this administration. It's true, Valerie Jarrett was on The Good Wife, and he'll pop up on every late-night talk show, but he doesn't go to something like this, and no one does that, nobody else. Andrea Mitchell apparently is also very critical. There are a bunch of Democrats who kind of recognize that as much as they want to really like the president, are just kind of stunned that not only did he not go, nobody else go. There's an interesting kind of theory floating around out there, Greg. Holder was in Paris but didn't attend the speech. Considering how it's such a giant speech, there's millions of people there that he basically, to not go to the speech, you have to deliberately avoid it. And the interesting idea of whether this was meant as some sort of intentional snub or some sort of intentional signal on the part of the administration to France and to other countries. Anyway, the way you look at it, it's disturbing and appalling. The only, as we said, the silver lining to this is that there's a pretty broad-based sense of disbelief and outrage and just absolute infuriated embarrassment that this administration doesn't seem to understand that this is important. And I think part of it might be is that I don't think they see this as, Obama came to fundamentally change America. Taking on Islamist terror wasn't really, that's what Bush did. That's not his thing. And, this president, he'd much rather sit in and watch football.
Speaking of football, Tapper did say, well, there was no one from the administration, but where were the congressional leaders? And he said Chris Christie, Scott Walker, Paul Ryan, all at the Packers-Cowboys game, and one of them, I think that was Paul Ryan, sending mocking tweets towards one of his potential 2016 rivals if he runs. So he was kind of spreading the blame around there a little bit, Jim. But when it comes to foreign policy, that is largely, almost entirely, the work of the executive branch. One
of the points that makes it such a striking picture yesterday was, Merkel, Cameron, Hollande, Netanyahu, it's heads of state, right? I mean, you usually only see those folks together at some sort of big international summit, and they're all sitting around a table. To see them walking the street arm in arm in a kind of a symbolic brotherhood, it's a very powerful image. And the American president's not there. We used to call the American president the leader of the free world. There's a big chunk of the free world, and even some groups we may not necessarily characterize as part of the free world. We may or may not think of Jordan that way. We may or may not think of the Palestinian Authority that way. There's a part of me that feels like, considering our longstanding beefs with members of the Muslim community who don't seem to denounce terrorism strongly enough, look, when you got some big Muslim leaders out there saying this is unacceptable, I want the American president out there standing with those guys to say amen. Just really bothers me. If you want to give the governor of New Jersey, the governor of Wisconsin, and the congressman from Wisconsin grief for not flying over to Paris, I guess, okay, I guess they could have done that, but I don't. Again, you're right. This is a role for the commander in chief and the national leader. And honestly, I think if any governor had flown over to Paris on late notice, I kind of think there'd be some folks who'd be accusing them of grandstanding. I could be wrong.
All right, quickly onto the crazy martini now, but we want to give it appropriate time because it's a big story that Jim is breaking today on National Review Online, and it concerns a very likely 2016 presidential candidate, Dr. Ben Carson. And in addition to all of his wonderful work in pediatric neurosurgery, he's also been affiliated with a supplement maker down in Texas called Manatech, who's now in a lot of trouble for making claims that seem to be, a little bit outlandish, including that it will cure cancer. And he's been very closely associated with them up until very, very recently, at least, Jim. So go ahead and take the ball from here.
Unsurprisingly, it went up around probably an hour and a half ago, and naturally the response from a certain chunk of the readership is, well, here comes the establishment trying to kill Ben Carson, which is more than a little bit bothersome, because I would just urge people, read out the whole article. I do my best to not editorialize in it, just to lay out the facts and let people draw their own conclusions. He might argue that there's no relationship there. Let's just say there's been interacting with this company, giving paid speeches at their annual conferences and things like that from back in 2004. And I think what really stands out is he's recorded some videos for them. And they're very clearly company videos talking about how good their products are and how good the company is. The company, the state of Texas, prosecuted, left charges of false advertising against this company. State officials called the false advertising particularly egregious. It was in court for 2 years, and the company settled, and they agreed to pay $4 million in restitution to former customers. But they insisted they did nothing wrong. Okay, fine, whatever. And so here's Carson out talking about glyconutritionals and things like that. I don't get into whether glyconutritionals are terrific or bad or anything like that. Readers can draw their own conclusions from it. What is not disputable is that the state of Texas looked at what they were advertising and said, no, you can't make those claims and you can't feature those claims from your customers because, you may have heard those advertisements, this product is not intended to cure, treat, or prevent any disease. Well, the comments from the testimonials of the customers indicated it could do autism, cancer, and all kinds of serious stuff like that. Not being a doctor myself, I'm rather skeptical that one supplement could do all kinds of fantastic things simultaneously. But again, the issue is not really the product. The issue is the false advertising of it. I'm kind of surprised to see somebody as indisputably brilliant and accomplished as Carson doing videos for a company like this. I call up Armstrong Williams, the business manager of Ben Carson. Armstrong Williams tells me he's not going to put me on the phone with Ben Carson, quote, because that is the decision that has been made, unquote. I think a refusal to answer questions about this is kind of bothersome. Williams said he didn't know about this Texas lawsuit. He didn't know about this settlement. He didn't know about any of this stuff. And I think that is troubling. If you're going to put your name on a product and say, hey, this stuff is good stuff, I think you really got to know about that product. And undoubtedly, there are some folks who really like Ben Carson and don't like seeing criticism of him and don't like seeing anybody writing things like this, particularly in a place like National Review. I kind of wonder if people think if I didn't write about it, would no one ever write about it? Would this remain secret forever? Everything in that story is factual and accurate. You can argue about whether you think it's important or not, but Ben Carson starts running for president, you're going to start seeing those videos up there. And I think he looks, I just say it's unflattering to have a really distinguished doctor out there touting those products when that company has been in that kind of trouble. So we'll see how it shakes out. The world may yawn at this, or the world might say, boy, oh boy, this is a big deal there. And we'll see how things shake out from there. But that's life in journalism, Greg, isn't it?
It is, absolutely so. Jim, enjoy another 2-hour delay in Fairfax County. Just assume that's general policy now. And
it is, yeah. Actually, they're canceling school until May.
Talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geragthy of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.